Hello, hello, Jacqueline Lane here at Vericent. We're doing a What I Wish I Knew episode with Jason Cahill, VP of Revenue Operations at Vensure. Today, we're going to be chatting about connecting and simplifying the revenue operations approach. And we're going to be getting Jason's take on how he got to revenue operations, what is revenue operations, and like why is revenue operations. We're going to talk about some disruptors. We're going to talk about some success factors in really knocking RevOps out of the park. So first, thank you so much for being here, Jason.
Thanks,
Tell us a little bit
Jacqueline.
about you.
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline. Always great to see you. Yeah, I've been in sales for around 24, 25 years, I think, at this point, or something sales related. Been bounced around a little bit, and most recently into sales enablement, marketing, various roles in marketing, and now into RevOps. But typically, I've worked in the HCM sector, so payroll, HR. That's how we met as well, and way back when, and a lot of different other industries too. I sold logistics. I sold cigarettes for a bit. That's a fun
Oh
story.
boy.
Yeah. So yeah. And now today I'm working at Vensure and Vensure ACM, and I'm in the VP of RevOps role.
Amazing. And so to start out with, I think this question I love to ask is like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And nobody says a salesperson, right?
hmm
My question is, how did you go from sales rep for many years to vice president of revenue operations almost overnight?
Yeah, yeah, it was quick. I got really no ego here, but I got really good at my sales role, and I love to experiment with what works and what doesn't work. I was a bit of a sales scientist, and I think I got it down to almost a science where I was very successful. My last year in sales, I was around 200% of plan, top three in the company, and I just got really bored, to be honest with you. And I thought that, hey, if I can do this, I can probably teach this to my coworkers as well. So I bugged the president of the company for a year and a half and said, hey, I'll see you at President's Club. And I've got a great idea to pitch you via video, actually. And eventually they took me up on my idea and I got into enablement. So that's kind of how I made that jump.
Amazing. And so we talked a little bit about, revenue operations and what I started with, like, what is revenue operations? Why is revenue operations? And have been doing tons of research. Revenue ops is one of those roles that is growing faster than almost anything else. I was reading a Forbes article where they did a bunch of research on what revenue operations is and a bunch of leaders across RevOps, and almost none of them have the same job description.
hmm
Um, and the big question is like, what is revenue operations? And so it's like a consolidation of um, sales ops, sales enablement, marketing ops, customer analytics, training and development. And I loved this quote: growing a business today is digital, it's data driven, technology enabled, team sport, which I think is like a super cool way to put it. However, there was never really a coach before.
Right.
And so I thought that was super cool. So let's talk about, your experience and how it lends to having observed this kind of disconnected approach that you've seen in a bunch of different companies, and how RevOps can lend some support.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, when I made the jump from sales to enablement, I got to see, firsthand of like how product informed strategy and training for the sales team, marketing, how that impacts the sales team, policy, operations, all of those things affect various parts of the sales organization and effectively just really revenue overall.
Mhm.
And so when I got into enablement, I got to see all these pieces and starting to liaison with different division leaders and understanding their position, how they approach the problem in their lane. And then we started to expand on like how those dependencies affect and impact the front line. So it was really more of like my introduction into aligning divisions and aligning people for a single goal. So I think that description is bang on.
Thanks. I wish I could take it. It's all Forbes.
Yeah.
So when we think about, so it sounds like kind of this perspective of misalignment, if you will, and then the beginning of aligning different groups. Let's talk a little bit about, how organizations have been for years growing revenue at all costs, but now there's a need to kind of dial back, right? Since COVID, things have changed. Businesses are looking to get back to basics, to be more efficient, to grow profitably. And so, what does that look like in the RevOps space from a, process, tech, people, culture? Like, where do you see your role in getting back to profitable revenue?
Yeah, I think once you start, building a tech stack or building divisions that need cross functionality and there start collaboration, it's eventually someone tries to assert it to be kind of like a cone. It starts to bottleneck, and then there's also the bottom starts to fall out when all that revenue and processes start to sit there and waiting for it to come out the other end. So as that starts to leak out, I think that everyone's kind of waiting for someone to fill that void of like, how are we going to fix this? Because there's so many, divisions and people that are responsible in their part for revenue. I think my role is more of to kind of streamline all of those divisions, the tech stack, the process and strategy, and plug up on any of the revenue leaks. So I like to work my way backwards. Start with the product, start with the customer in mind, the end in mind, if you will, and work my way backwards, and then understand which streams go to each division or division leader or product, for example, in the tech stack, and then understand how that links back to the customer experience and how eventually we maximize the impact of revenue.
And so I think, you hit the nail on the head in terms of a bunch of research that I've done as well. And, part of getting back to the basics is, I think we heard of this 1,000 times in sales, is the leaky bucket, right?
Yeah.
So you can fill your funnel, you can close as much as you want, but at the end of the day, if your customers are leaking at the end and you're churning, you're never going to get ahead.
Yeah, so, exactly. I think there's been a major shift, I think, from cost of customer acquisition costs and looking at how much is it to just get new business instead of not just focusing on new business generation, but also what we got. It's a very competitive, global marketplace out there. And if you're lucky enough to get a customer, you got to hold on to it and maximize your share of wallet.
And so when we think about that, how do you get to the diagnosis part? So, in really identifying the problems that we just did, which is, disconnected people, disconnected processes, solving problems in silos, right? Which leads to that kind of wedge, and stuff is still leaking out the bottom and bottlenecks and all this stuff. So in an effort to kind of look at it from more of a high level, where do you start with the diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. I think I start at the very beginning with data. Everything, I believe, starts with data. I'm kind of a data nerd, I guess. When I was in sales, like I was in Salesforce all the time. Operations said, stop sending us cases, please. Because I wanted my Salesforce to be exactly perfect. Mm-hmm. And from this perspective, even on the RevOps team, even when I was in enablement, I dove into Salesforce or any other data specific, anything that I could get my hands on, and just understand like what's true and what we value, not just what we can measure, and then just aligning that with expectations throughout the organization. So, do we really, as an example, do we really want to know how many MQLs or marketing qualified leads that we've got in the funnel, or do we really want to know how many opportunities that we have in the funnel, or do we want to know something even more specific? Is it like how many were driven by marketing, how many were driven by a BC or rep? How many are involve a specific competitor? How many products, what revenue value, and then also understanding what does that actually mean to that person who's asking me for that. What's the value to them?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we need to shift what we value from, and like I said, from what we can just measure, and then measuring what we value instead.
Yeah, I think, what, again, going back to our sales roots, I think, we've both been in a number of different organizations where sales reps are measured on different things, right? So at some sales organizations, I was measured on the number of face-to-face meetings. Other places, you're measured on the number of phone calls you make. Others, back at our old sales days together, it was like, how many connects did you make in our prospecting days?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, all of that is fine. But now in the world of a tremendous amount of data, I think you say something interesting in that let's not just attach value to things that we already have data for. Right. So I think that's what I heard.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, let's continue to peel back the onion. What are we really trying to get at? And does it move forward what we're trying to accomplish?
Right. Yeah. Can we measure what we value and not value what we measure?
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly it. Mm-hmm.
And so in your experience, it's almost impossible to get Salesforce or any other place where lots of people are entering all kinds of different data 100% accurate. But what's been your experience gathering data and pulling out analytical information for decision making in a place where there's lots of different data sources?
Yeah, I think it's definitely challenging. There's a lot of Excel spreadsheets and a lot of Word docs and chicken scratches on multiple sheets of scrap paper. It's definitely, you have to understand also, modeling helps quite a lot. So there's even more technology on top of that. So there's a lot of different data sets and data points that you're looking at. You're looking for, almost commonality between those data points. And it's not always easy to do when it's not all in the same place.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is that we hear a ton about this, and a great amount of the research that I read is, disparate data makes it near impossible to constantly rely and get reliable analytics out. Another thing that we talked about that is important in your role and that really stood out to me as a leader is how much you lean on your people and creating change and a culture of learning. So can we talk a little bit about that and how that folds into your RevOps role?
Yeah, absolutely. So, going beyond my sales enablement role, I was lucky enough to move into the marketing space, which I don't know how they thought that I was going to be adequate to move into marketing, but I'm lucky and I'm glad I did because I learned quite a bit. Being in the marketing organization is extremely valuable. But I don't think many people get that opportunity to be that, transfer into a completely different division when they have, I had no experience. Though the person that recruited me said, well, enablement's kind of like product marketing and it's kind of included in there. So let's give it a shot. And I think you can't be a one-trick pony because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Strategy is great until it changes, and then you got to make a new strategy, and then you have to, strategize with someone you've never met before, or you've never interacted with before, and you have to understand their perspective and have empathy for their role and what they value. So I think developing a culture of learning in an organization is extremely important because you want innovation. You want to fuel innovation to grow your organization. People have great ideas and different perspectives, and I think it's important to listen to them.
Well, it was one of the quotes. And so for those people watching and listening, Jason has about a zillion of these little nuggets. So I said, RevOps is a team sport, and he's got 40 of those in the back of his mind at all times. One of the things was culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
So can you tell me a little bit why that stuck out in your mind and why it might be relevant to today?
Yeah, I think that, with a lot of moving parts in any organization, there are players and leaders that come in and out of organizations. They have different strategies. The market changes, a new legislation comes out, and all of a sudden the strategy changes. But you have to breed a culture of learning, like I mentioned, but also just that culture will destroy your strategy in a second. Because if you're not in a culture of learning, you're not pliable, or you have that neuroplasticity in your brain to be like, okay, well, strategy changed and now I got to change with it. It's just, it's Tuesday, whatever. You just got to go with the flow. And if you've got that mental block and you just don't go with the flow, and you don't think you can switch lanes and just pivot on a dollar, then you're not going to be able to make it, So that's why I think, investing in your people, investing in training, investing in a culture of learning, that also comes with, cross-functional teams, collaboration, and empathy for someone else who's beside you, and maybe in a different division, but you really need to understand their role in the revenue process, because we're all trying to serve the same goal. We're all trying to get revenue.
Yeah. So I mentioned to you when we spoke first a while ago, recently connected, in the keynote that our chief product officer gave, he talked about the fact that there are 3 roles in an organization, like 3 key roles, not functions, but roles. Either you're bringing in revenue, you're protecting revenue, or you're serving people who do one or the other. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that you've got this kind of strong North Star regarding revenue, it takes a level of communication, right? Because there are lots of people who've been in a particular function their whole career, 15, 20, 30 years, whatever. And they don't necessarily know how their role rolls up to one of those 3 jobs within a company. So when we think about, streamlining tools, streamlining operations, streamlining teams, what are your thoughts on kind of where you even start with that? Like, I've got kind of data and analytics from what the market says, but, where would you start when you think about bringing people together, evaluating processes, and evaluating tools in the RevOps?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I like to do the initial, data dump, and align that data, get my insights together. But then I like having conversations directly with people. And that data often checks everyone's ego, because you might think that this is important, or you might think that this is affecting, downstream customer acquisition in a certain way, but it really isn't. And data can actually, be that truth teller, and it's not necessarily, like a tool or a stick to hit someone over the head with. It's, right. Hey, things have changed, and perhaps, you weren't aware of this, but we should all get aligned and make sure that this happens. So I think streamlining those tools and operations starts with like data, as I mentioned, and I think face-to-face conversation and collaboration.
Mm-hmm. So as we get kind of to the end of what we're chatting about, what would you say are the main detractors, or the things that distract people away from the company's North Star? So growing profit, growing revenue, as the North Star. What do you think are the biggest distractors that you see or expect to see in RevOps?
Yeah, I think, there things happen every day, day-to-day companies, people leave projects or leave the company, new people come in, they've got their own ideas, and they, you feel like you're kind of starting at zero in some respects. But I think some of the detractors could be, just new tech stack is introduced, and how does that fit in? Well, we used to do it this way, and now we're using this tool, and we can't do it that way this time. And now, let's all have a meeting or multiple meetings on this. When really, we really want to get the data, like what's the result? Can we get, what can we work with? And what can I work with within the tech stack or within the results that I am getting? Let's focus on the things that we can make it perfect later on. But as long as I'm getting something out of this, let's just work with what we got. One of my isms is swords on the floor. So let's everyone, defending a castle keep, you throw your sword, all the weapons on the castle floor. What do you got to work with? Well, I've got this and I've got this. Okay, well, let's go. Let's go to war. We're doing that every single day. We're trying to win revenue over and above our competition. How are we going to do that? With any means necessary, anything we've got. And if things get better on later on, great. If things get worse, we'll deal with it. But as long as we're aligned and we're all relying on each other and have clear communication of how we're going to market right now, right this second, not 5 months from now, right now, then I think then we can win.
I love it. I love it. So considering you've had such a varied career, what advice would you give to someone who's starting out in revenue operations, or starting out a career, or a new career for that matter?
Yeah, I think you probably got this from our conversation, but I feel like you got to try everything. Try everything. You talk to everybody. Align yourself with stakeholders in every division. Understand their role. Understand what they hold valuable to themselves and then to the rest of the organization, and where they think they fit in and where they actually fit in. I think that's helped me immensely, is connecting with different people and learning how marketing fits in. I was completely turned around of like how salespeople typically think of marketing. I was like, well, you're just getting me leads. Well, no, actually, we're impacting strategy. We're doing customer research. We're doing all these things. So I feel like if you really want to grow your career, you've got to learn everything. You got to talk to a lot of people. Get involved. Don't shrink away from the spotlight. Get into the spotlight. Present. Get really good at that. And I think above all, you can never fail when you're keeping revenue as your North Star. If revenue attainment, it's what makes everyone, that's why we're all here. You keep that as your North Star, I think you won't fail.
Well, I think that's the one thing that has constantly stood out when you and I speak, is that, even when you talked about implementing a new tech stack, I think people can get lost in the weeds, right?
Yeah.
So, this needs to integrate with this. This needs to have this functionality. And really the intention is always why, and does it contribute back to that North Star? So I think that that's almost like baked into your DNA, is constantly referencing revenue as a North Star, and curiosity on how to improve it, dissect it, take away barriers, and grow. So that's something pretty unique to you, Jason. So
yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a reason why my toaster isn't an Internet of Things, automated, right? It just makes toast. I don't really need to think about what tech stack or how do I integrate this with my network at home. I just want the toast, right? So I think that when you talk about tech stack and how does this new tool automate these things, and oh, well, we can't get it. So then, leads stop or sales stop. We can't have that. So if we have to, do this manually with the good old toaster and just press down the button instead of like programming it from my phone, we still get the net result. We want that, right? We want revenue.
Yeah, I hear you. So we are just about to move into one of my favorite sections of our What I Wish I Knew episodes, which is quick questions, where we pick your brain, intended to be real fast, but I inevitably have 1,000 follow-up questions. But let's move into some of our quick questions. What did you want to be when you grow up? Don't dare say a salesperson, because then you'd be ruining what I've been saying the whole time.
Never happened. No, never happened. I've always wanted to be a writer, actually. I loved words from the beginning. I think words they can, they start wars, they end wars, they make you feel feelings. It's just something on a page that is outside of you. Words are incredibly powerful. So I've always wanted to be a writer.
Very cool. I think you and I talked about this. We share this.
That's right.
Tell me your number one follow on LinkedIn other than me.
Other than you, that's a big shortfall after that. I mean, I'm going to probably say Rory Sutherland is probably my number one LinkedIn follow. And if you haven't read his book, Alchemy, it's unbelievable. It changed my life, especially coming from a marketing role. It was unbelievable. So if you follow him on LinkedIn, it's amazing the things he said.
Very cool. For those of you who don't, please follow. And lastly, what do you wish you knew more about?
I think, well, Yeah, I think finance probably is something that I'd like to know a little bit more of. I just finished my MBA. I was always absolutely terrible, horrible, terrible at math. I failed math 3 times. Full disclosure, I had to go get extra help, and I'm really good with words, really bad with numbers. However, somehow corporate finance was one of my best subjects, and I think it wasn't the actual math calculation. I think it was the strategy and what goes in and what comes out. I found that absolutely fascinating. I'd love to serve on a board someday. Disregard the bad thing about math. I'm better now. But but I think corporate finance I find is really, really interesting. It's like a secret code that you have to decipher. So I find that
Yeah,
fascinating.
we talked about that. I was like, there are these secret societies of like lawyers and mechanics and accountants and finance experts.
Right.
Probably.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so thank you so much for sharing. I would say the three things that were real takeaways, not just from today's conversations, but the conversations we've had over time, um, is I love that you called yourself a sales scientist. You know, there's this innate curiosity that you have about digging in and pulling apart whatever it is that you're working on at that time. So I love that you took the time to figure out like what makes this work and how can you pull it apart and make it better. I think that that's a really solid tidbit for anyone listening to get better at what they do. The second big thing is not just blindly following requests or asks with yes. It's more like, well, why? And what is the purpose? And does it work with our North Star? And the third thing was this culture of learning and not being afraid to step outside of your zone or your lane. So just because you work in a particular function, it doesn't mean that you can't add value or find areas for opportunity across the business. So overall, really fruitful conversation. Appreciate your take on revenue operations, despite that Forbes says it's a jillion people who have a jillion different jobs in your role,
It
but your
absolutely
take
is.
specifically. So thank you so much for being here.
My absolute pleasure, Jacqueline. Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, what do you wish you knew more about? It's right here. Follow us on LinkedIn for episode updates.